Welcome to Raging Bullets, a DC Comics fan podcast, episode 175. Welcome to Raging Bullets. I'm Sean Whalen, Dr. Norge on the comic forums, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jim, the sensei of the whatnot Segulin. This is a very special episode this week as we are joined by Freddie E. Williams II, artist and author of the DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics. And we're discussing that book, which is going to be released this week on September 1st. This is a great chance to pick up this book. It's available at Amazon.com. It's regularly $22.95. They have it at 32% off, only $15.61. And if you haven't had a chance to pick it up, head on over to Amazon.com. Any of your major bookstores are going to have this. Definitely check online, check at your local bookstore. They can all order it. But if you haven't picked this one up, it's a great book. But we'll tell you why on this episode, why you should pick that one up. Also sponsoring us this episode is DCBService.com and InStockTrades.com. At DCBService.com, this week you're going to see the brand new books being listed for September. They're brand new deals. They have amazing discounts, up to 75% off for pre-orders. It's great on a tight comic book budget right now to try and get those discounts. And DCB Service continues to support us with that, so definitely I'm always excited. This is my favorite week of the month because I get to see what the new discounts are on the upcoming books. InStockTrades.com is supporting us with our Book of the Month. Preacher Book 1, the hardcover, issues 1 through 12, regularly $39.99, 47% off, only $21.19. Volume 1 and Volume 2, they're also supporting us with, so if you want to go the trade paperback route, $14.99 regularly, 47% off, only $7.94 each. If you pick up both of those, you're getting issues 1 through 17. So it's a great bargain route if you want to go that route. Remember, at InStockTrades.com, orders of $50 or more get you free shipping. And DCBService.com is your pre-order source. So thank you to both of those sponsors for supporting us. And this episode, because we're going to be talking specifically about Freddie's book, I'm going to jump you right into that discussion right now.
Nice work, Atom. What are these characters up to?
Joining us for this discussion on the DC Comics Guide to Digital Drawing of Comics is Freddie E. Williams II, the author. And Freddie, welcome back to Raging Bullets.
Thank you both guys for having me on. I appreciate it.
You're also the artist on the upcoming JSA All-Stars and Final Crisis Aftermath run.
As we speak, I'm finishing up the 6th and final issue of Final Crisis Aftermath run, and then I'll be starting, back-to-back. As soon as I'm done with run, I'll be working on JSA All-Stars.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. It's a huge team. It's 10 people, and that's the most I've ever drawn in a group before. So I'm both excited and scared by that.
Really excited that you are going to be on JSA because I love that team in general, and I've been loving so much what Willingham and Sturgis have been doing with the writing of this book, and I love their Fables work and everything, that this is just, it's to see you with, I like what you guys are doing together on Run, so it seems like to be a really great partnership, and I'm excited for you and to see what you guys get to do with this book.
Matt Sturgis is a really cool guy, and the first couple times we spoke on the phone, it was for like several hours apiece, and he's a big into Superman. He has some of the similar views and experiences that I did when I was a kid and whatever. And when we met each other at the San Diego Con, we connected pretty well there in person as well. So, in other words, I'm very happy also to be working with him. And from what I understand, I think he actually suggested me for JSA All-Stars. So I think I owe him for that. He suggested me for the book whenever they asked him if he would be willing to do it.
So it shows he's got taste.
No comment.
That's gonna be a fun book though, because the lineup of characters is so diverse. The DC Comics Guide to Digital Drawing. Freddie, what is the difference? One of the first things when I saw this, when you think about digital drawing, I've read comics since I was a kid. What is the difference between drawing digitally and traditional methods for an artist standpoint? Because I've had the pleasure of seeing you at cons. You've drawn a number of commissions for me. You drew that wonderful Superman one and the Robin one, which is one of my favorites. So I've seen you doing the pencil sketches. What's the difference as an artist, though, to be working digitally?
Let's see, the essential part of it is it's the same, because we're still drawing with our hand, holding, but instead of holding a normal writing implement, we're holding a stylus, either for a Wacom tablet, which is basically for anyone who's ever gone to a grocery store and has to sign their name on the credit card, the little screen or whatever. That's essentially you're holding a stylus, or if you have a PDA or something like that, each of those uses a stylus. Some people, like I use a Wacom tablet, other people use a Cintiq where you're drawing basically right directly on the screen so you can see where you're writing or drawing. So essentially we're using the same tool or the same idea. We're still using our hand to draw, but past that, working digitally to draw anything, comic books included, it basically gives you the opportunity to correct your work or to try new ideas without being detrimental to your old work. For example, if you have an idea for a pose that you're working on and you like that, but you then suddenly have another idea, you can turn off the layer of the first idea, turn it off so that it's no longer visible, and then just start sketching your next idea. Now, if that new idea pans out, great. If it doesn't, though, you can delete it or turn it off and then go back to your first idea with no detriment to either sketch. In that sense, it's more diverse. It's also, you can tweak body proportions and other things until you're happy with it. So if you've drawn, I know for me, the entire time I'm doing convention sketches, I'm thinking to myself, oh, I wish I had a, undo. I just, I'm inking someone's face and my hand didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. And now I'm either stuck with it as it is, or I have to try to make the line thicker to cover up the mistake, or I have to white it out, but then something about using whiteout, it changes the texture of that specific eye and all that stuff. I'm not a big fan of using whiteout. Those things come up when you're working traditionally. When you're working digital, it's less of an issue because you could either erase it very easily without using whiteout, or you can, if you drew the eye at the wrong angle, you just select it with your lasso tool and then rotate it so that it's at the correct angle. You can scale it to be a different size. I think that that's probably a good primer for why people might work digitally and what the difference is. So it's still the same ideas, but it's just a little bit more diverse, and you have has more versatility.
More freedom.
Exactly, more freedom.
What led to the creation of this book? Like, why a how-to book? How did you get involved in this? What was the driving force behind it?
Let's see, I was actually pretty hesitant, or reticent at least, of working on a how-to book when the idea was first brought up to me, not by DC, but by just a couple of my friends who were, saw how I was working. They thought that it was an interesting and unique way of working, and they suggested, or they basically asked me, are you going to make a book? Are you going to write a book out of this? And to be honest, it felt kind of arrogant, the idea of writing a how-to book, because it felt like it would be perceived as if I was saying, this is how you do things. I figured it all out. Freddie Williams has figured out this process, and this is how you should do it. It was about a course over the first year that I was working for DC, I had several conversations with different friends where each of them made a good point along the lines of, it's not about arrogance, it's about sharing the idea, sharing the knowledge of it. It could possibly open up other ways of working from other people, that meaning I don't have to put out the book as if it's a definitive statement on this is the way to work. You can put it out and say, this is what I have found has worked for me, and then go from there. And if people, but always keep the tone throughout the book, and I try to do this very much throughout the book, that this might not be the only way to work or the best way to work, but it has worked well for me, and it's a process hopefully others can learn from, and that sort of thing. Aside from that, the way that it became a reality, I guess, is I had put together, after speaking to my friends and stuff, I had put together an outline for what the book would cover. It's also known as a pitch, basically just something short and sweet that I could give to a potential publisher to see if they're interested in the contents of the book. And I had that together, but nothing further than that, about the same time that DC Comics was offering me my exclusive contract. And for those who might not derive what that means, an exclusive basically says that I cannot go outside of DC for comic book related work. And this how-to book would be kind of a gray area because it's not necessarily comic books. I mean, I'm talking about comics for sure, but I'm not drawing a comic. In my negotiations in my contract, I was speaking to the legal representative at DC, or one of them, and I brought up the how-to book, and he said, basically it was kind of his idea. He just said, well, have you thought about bringing it here? Have you thought about pitching it here? And I had not, even though I was aware of and had most of the how-to books in the DC line of stuff. They have one for writing, one for penciling, one for inking, and then the one right before mine is focused on digital lettering and coloring. I spoke to the DC licensing department, and it was right up their alley. They were very receptive to it, where they said, hey, that sounds like it's right up our alley. It would work real well in our line of how-to books. It would be the logical progression even from their standpoint. on what would be the next how-to book.
Throughout the book, there was a lot of words like explore and play. You were really encouraging people to take a look at your framework, take a look at the way that how you do it, but also to go beyond that, go in their own direction. One of the things I love about comics is the fact that every artist is unique. And it's because you guys are all trying new things, playing around with the tools that are already there, and that every month when you see a new issue from somebody, you're going to get something different, something. And, that's part of the joy of appreciating any art form.
There's been times while I've been working, it was before the how-to book, it was just while I was developing my own digital workflow, that I would learn from somebody who may not work in Photoshop as much as I do, just looking over their shoulder, and I saw something they did, and I was like, whoa, how'd you do that? I think that if anyone who's learning, any program, not just Photoshop, but as long as they don't have, overly blown expectations on how fast they're going to adapt to things, and they're not afraid to just save different versions of files and try things on new layers, basically, so they're not committing to something that might be destructive or disappointing to their results, and just get in there and just start playing. As opposed to building up in your mind an expectation or a fear or something along those lines of being nervous about trying it so much so that you might get perfection paralysis or something. I think that if somebody keeps an open mind and just tries to do the basics, but then as they work on the basics, their skill set will grow out of that, like as they discover to do more things from it. So, and actually, even my technique evolved throughout because it took me like about 2.5 years, a little less than that, to write the book. My process even changed throughout it.
I want to jump to something in Chapter 5 that I was thinking when I was reading it. Chapter 5 is digital and hybrid workflows. As I looked at the layout of the chapters, it's very step-by-step, which you were talking about the amount of time it takes. Don't feel like when you're jumping into digital that you're going to jump into it and get it right away. This takes some time. You got to learn the process. I liked the step-by-step elements of it because I was thinking about an artist right now who's working on deadlines, for example, somebody who's considering maybe dabbling in this and trying to do some digital work. I liked the step-by-step layout of the book because of the fact I felt, you could do a couple of steps, take a break, keep your own deadlines with whatever company you're working for right now, but then you could come back and pick up right where you left off. It was very easy to follow the flow throughout the entire book. And the whole book's laid out that way. But it was something I noticed in that chapter in particular was just how easy it was to follow the steps.
That's very sweet of you. No.
I don't know if we should cuddle now or what. It's like
I would feel violated if we did. I'm glad that it came off like that. I didn't want, because I tried to break down the book into bite-sized steps throughout the whole book. The book is like 10, 12 chapters, something. I guess it's 12 chapters. But although the first chapter is more of an introduction, and then chapter 12 is more like a looking forward to the future. So it's basically 10 chapters of substance for digitally drawing. And in Chapter 5, when I do talk about the digital and hybrid workflows, there's even an exercise in there, like you were saying, that basically I wanted to, since everything else in the book is compartmentalized, I wanted to give a microcosm look at the workflow, which is what Chapter 5 is about. It's so that you can see how does all this work together? Where am I at in this process? It's almost like an overhead map of the procedure. And there's even an exercise in there where you're starting from a completely blank document, and I take you through step-by-step from the roughs, so you're doing digital roughs, to the tighter version of the roughs, which is called breakdowns, to then wireframes, to all the way through to the inks stage. I don't cover coloring because the last book you can look at for that, so I just covered the rest of the artwork, just creating basically the black and white steps of it. That was actually a really good idea that my friend Jim Mitchell, the one who wrote Chance of a Lifetime, because he was saying he wasn't sure where to jump in at, and if we had a step-by-step, then that would at least give somebody an exercise they could then go, okay, now I understand what this is like on a small scale. Let's get into manufacturing actual pages. So I thought that was a pretty cool idea.
Was it hard to create a book that caters to both the all-digital and hybrid methods? Because I noticed throughout the book you provided walkthroughs and opportunities for people, because I know you work all digitally, because it really did a really nice job of showing both methods. I know as a fan for myself, one of the reasons why I read this, I'm always interested in comic creation and what that process looks like. It's made me just really respect what all of you guys do in order to put together an issue. But I can imagine from an artist, a professional artist who's looking through this, you're going to get people who want to dabble in continuing to do the pencil and go into some digital, or they want to go all digital. So you've got a wide audience who are looking for a lot of different options on how to use this. Was it hard for yourself, though, to craft a book that covers both?
That was actually one of the easier aspects of creating the book, just in the sense that is the same. Well, I guess I struggled with the concept of how you could utilize the advantages of working digitally, but then utilize that in a traditional workflow. And so that was, like you had said, that I work all digital, and that is true for the vast majority of pages, but I'll pick basically the hybrid method of working developed from my own experimentation with trying to have some sort of originals at the end of this process. And so I would started off with one single page of just trying, what can I get away with digitally, and then how do I get it onto the artboard? Do I need to light box it? Can I print light blue? Or since I'm inking this, can I find a way to print high-resolution, crisp, black lines of the structure onto the artboard? And that was the process that I went through. So documenting it afterwards was actually pretty simple, because I understood from my own perception what the concerns would be of an artist who still wants original pages at the end of the process. Working digital has so many advantages, but one of its only, and it definitely its biggest disadvantage, is that at the end, if you work only digital, then you have nothing left. You have no originals to show or to sell later. And that's a really big disadvantage, just from trying to make a living, basically.
Yeah, with Chapter 2, Why Go Digital, I like the fact that this did have pros and cons listed. This isn't just a book about, woohoo, digital's so great, forget about the other stuff, get rid of the old, in with the new type thing. It's showing the pluses and the minuses here. There's some stuff you got to deal with. And I got to say, I really just like the fact that periodically throughout this book, you kept calling in for backup. Well, backing up the files, but calling in for backup, same deal.
Yeah, calling in for backup. Yeah, one of the other disadvantages of working digitally is that there is the real potential of losing data, either from a hard drive crash or a virus or something like that. And if you have a thorough and methodical backup procedure, then effectively you don't have to worry about it. So, and backing up in general is just a good idea. It's a good habit to be in. So, I definitely call for people to use backups in general, and I describe my process of backing up, which is pretty
extensive. That's a nice layout you got there with that. You had a daily, then when the issue's done, then and it was just, I was like, wow, that's really going out there. I'm like, outstanding.
Wow, that's slightly psychotic.
I wasn't going to say psychotic. I was going to say actually good.
I can relate to you now. You could shoot a bullet at my computer now, and I would lose anything.
Yeah, it wasn't for anything on DC. It was back when I was doing work for Speakeasy. I lost about 3 days worth of work or something, and I mean, 3 days is, you can count it on one hand, but to me that's that's a work week for most people. That's like 45 hours probably worth of work for most people. So it was maddening, and the fact that I couldn't recover any of the data. It was like, I've got to start making more methodical backups.
The intro by Brian Boland was very cool. How cool was that? How did that come about?
That was all my editor, John Morgan, is my editor for the how-to book, and we're friends now as well. Over the last couple of years, we've got to know each other really well. But he asked me for a list of digital illustrators, digital comic book artists that he might be able to contact to get someone to write a foreword or an intro for the book. I don't know he might have already knew that he was digital, that Brian Boland was digital, but he was on my list. There was 2 or 3 other guys. That's the extent of my knowledge, but it was, as far as how it came about, it was very cool, though, to see anything by Brian Boland. I mean, he's been around for a long time. He's still producing great work, and he's been working digital for much longer than me. I remember seeing some sort of very short tutorial that he posted online that was probably for Photoshop 7, or maybe it was even earlier than that, and that's been a few years ago, so it was very cool to see that from him.
I just want to go through real quick what some of the chapters are, and we can chat a little bit about them along the way. There's Chapter 1, Genesis, which is how you broke into comics. There's Chapter 2, which we just kind of talked about, Why Go Digital. When we get to Chapter 3, the tools you need, I'm a techie myself, and I really liked seeing this one because it's, can I use what I already have? what do I need? Do I need a PC or a Mac? Softwares, tablet you need, tips for your working environment, ergonomics. I was like, yes. I'm like, you're preaching to the choir here. I love it. And even how to calibrate and change the settings on your monitor or the tablet to suit your needs. I thought it was great that you added so many personal, tiny elements to make this transition as stress-free as possible, because you talked about how this is a process that it's going to take you some time if you haven't dabbled in it before to really kind of adjust to trying to work this way. But I liked that you put in some tips for people based on your own, I guess stresses maybe would be the word, as you were developing your own work environment. Like, hey, these are some things that I just learned that were going to be really helpful. I really appreciated that.
Great. Yeah, and the ergonomics, well, first of all, I even stress in there, like the very first thing I think I talk about is that technology is a moving target. So even as this book gets published, basically the clock is ticking for as far as technology and how long the specific RAM and processor and monitor size requirements or whatever, those things will quickly become outdated by the numbers. So I do list the things I'm using right now, but make it clear that these aren't the numbers that will always be correct. It's just about finding what works well for you. And the reason that I put in there a mention about ergonomics is it's something that I think especially guys who are in their, early to mid-20s don't think about as much as they should. I know I did not. So, and after a long weekend of working in a computer or any environment, and that includes just drawing comic books traditionally, if I was slouched over and stuff, back when I was working, doing a lot of freelance work for Palladium, the role-playing game company, I had just a lap desk, and I would sit either with my legs crossed on the floor in front of my couch or with my legs tucked underneath me with my shins flat against the ground, and I would do that for all of Friday night and then all of Saturday and Sunday, and by Monday, my back and my legs would really be hurting, and that's not the best ergonomic way of sitting, obviously. So I mentioned that sort of thing in there, the mention about ergonomics and adjusting your settings so that your eyes aren't strained, and even for the Wacom settings, you can change the mapping so that the mapping on a Wacom tablet is the area in which you can inhibit the area that you're drawing on your Wacom tablet. So even the Wacom tablet that I'm drawing on, even as we're speaking, is a 6x8 Wacom tablet, but I have the area that I'm drawing in mapped down so that it's probably only, about a 3x4 area, something like that. And the reason is because the smaller motions of my hand or wrist pay off much larger on the screen. It also depends on how far you're zoomed in, but I can draw, not to get too technical, and I don't know the specific names for it, but imagine if you're standing at a blackboard and you need to draw a really long straight line. You will most likely, where you draw from will be from your shoulder. Like that'll be the pivot point for where you're drawing the line from. So and that applies also to when you're drawing on a large piece of paper on a drafting board or something. Usually if you're drawing a really long line, other than using a ruler, of course, you're going to be mostly drawing from your elbow or from your shoulder. Since I've isolated my body where the majority of my body is not moving while I'm drawing comics, all that's really moving is my left hand's hitting hotkeys, and then my right forearm and wrist and hand are the only thing that's moving over on the right-hand side. I'm actually pointing to it like you guys could see it, like the right-hand side of my, where my Wacom tablet is. And it's good to minimize movements. That way you don't get the repetitive stress injuries or whatever they're called, and that you're not wasting a lot of movement or drawing something on the screen that might look a little shaky, and that's because you're trying to draw too large in a way. So you need to zoom in a little bit more and maybe reduce your mapping so that the smaller lines you're drawing actually look like longer, more fluid lines on the screen.
I thought it was great in Chapter 3 that you really went through just the whole work environment, how it was set up, PC or Mac. Well, there's ways to work in both environments, and you can use these same tools in both environments, which was great. Because I think traditionally, I was always told Macs were the ones, if you're doing art, you got to do them on a Mac. And I was surprised to see that, hey, no, there's options both ways. And I thought it was great that you went through and you left it very open to people being able to use things. If they're already used to working in one environment, go with that environment because of your comfort level.
Even myself, I work on mainly a Mac now, but I have a PC laptop, and so it's what I work on whenever I'm out of town. And actually, for several years, that laptop was my main working computer. Even if I was here at the house, I would still work on it on the PC laptop. So, and for years, when I was working at Hallmark and here at home, I was going between Mac and PC all the time. So I know from experience that as far as when you're in Photoshop especially, there is no difference as long as you have the same sort of, RAM and processor and stuff. If you have a Mac and a PC sitting side by side running the same requirements and running Photoshop, you're all set. I mean, they're both the same. So, I just, whatever will make the transition as easy as possible for somebody. Because actually one of the target audiences that I was picturing while writing this was somebody like Mike Norton, who now he's working more digital, but actually when I first started writing the book, he was wanting to break into that. I remember at a convention talking to him about it. We were at a bar the night before or something, even though I don't drink. I was drinking Pepsi while he was drinking other things. But he was like, and I think he said something like, man, I've really got to try getting into this digital stuff. And since then he has, but I was picturing to myself, he's got deadlines. He doesn't have time to just to kill. I mean, he's not just doing this recreationally. So if there's anything that can ease him into it. So I even talk about, if you're a starter at this, one thing you might want to try is, scanning in your rough layouts and then manipulating those in Photoshop. That will get you familiar with the tools while you're in there, and it'll also give you a better end result in your art because your roughs will be more, you will have tweaked them until you're happy with the nuances of it. Somebody who is professional or semi-professional breaking in really does need to be mindful of their time, and so I wanted to be considerate of that.
In Chapter 4, you go through the various palettes that you have set up in Photoshop. And I liked that even though you were assuming in that by the time they hit that chapter, these are people that typically have an intermediate or advanced understanding of how Photoshop works. And one of the things I know about any software program is the way you and I can use the exact same program. We could have been using it for the exact same amount of time, but the way you have your program customized to the way I may have customized it for myself could be very different. In order for us to have a common ground, I need to know, okay, how do you got this set up? What are you doing? And you go through step by step what your palettes look like, what your settings are like for Photoshop, assuming that, hey, we could be doing this very differently in the way that we're looking at it, which I really appreciated in that kind of seeing the different layers and palettes that you use throughout your process.
It gave a good little kind of snapshot of what is Adobe Photoshop. So if you're sitting there and you're not used to using this, if you go through the book, you're not only getting the aspects behind digital comic book creating, you're getting some basic kind of intro to the tools that are being used in it. So it's kind of a nice little just introduction to what is the program. You can see and say, oh yeah, I could do that. Oh yeah, okay, I see that. Yeah, even like an idiot like me, when I was reading this, I was like, this is something I could actually maybe even do. Wow, that's kind of cool.
Great, good. Well, and that is the desired result. And let's face it, when somebody opens up Photoshop for the very first time, now this book is not trying to say step by step on how to use all of Photoshop. However, I acknowledge that there might be some people who have had very limited experience with Photoshop, and hopefully they'll be able to get caught up and work through the book. And so I try to angle stuff towards that, at least give good jumping on points if you're I want it to be an intermediate user, but to get you to that level, I'm willing to help a little bit. So there's a lot of stuff visually when you first install Photoshop. There's a lot of palettes, and quite honestly, in comics, or at least the way that I create comic books digitally, I just don't need all those palettes. So there's a lot of stuff that at least when I customize my workspace, that I've eliminated, and everyone should feel free to do that because you can still get those palettes back. It's not like you're, destroying them. You're just making it so you don't see them anymore. I think it's like this with anything. I mean, even the first time, this might not be the greatest analogy, but the first time I ever went to the San Diego Comic Convention, I was so overwhelmed by everything that I saw. It's like I was trying to take in too much at once. And once I realized I can only take in so much at a time, I'll just take it in bite-sized chunks. That's when I stopped feeling so panicky. I didn't feel as freaked out anymore. And it's the same thing with any computer program, so Photoshop is no exception to that. Just eliminate what you're not going to use and then just focus on a handful of things at a time.
I think it's one of the things that is unique about art is the fact that in order for you to grow and to create new things and to try new avenues, you got to play around with the programs. I'm instructional tech at my school district, and a lot of times, especially for people who are, like you said, people that are just dabbling into Photoshop and just kind of coming in at that point, you were trying to bring them along as well. When I've got new teachers that are trying to break in and dabble, and I always encourage them, one of the reasons why kids learn so much faster than adults is because they're not afraid to play. And I do think as adults, we know the cost of a lot of times computers and software. So we think that you can't play with it anymore. And that's actually just the opposite of what's true. You need to play.
Well said. I hadn't thought of it like that. That's a very good analogy.
I liked that theme of the book because I felt that all the way through. And I think that's really an important thing because it was accessible because of that.
Great.
We already talked a little bit about Chapter 5, the digital and hybrid workflows. We get into Chapter 6 and we're talking about the master page. What is a master page? For people maybe who aren't aware of what it is, or people who are maybe, because I'm figuring that people who are going to pick up this book also are people maybe who are just getting into comic art, as well as people who are professionals who are already in it. What is a master page?
A master page template is kind of a phrase that I coined for the book. I mean, it's basically, to break it down, it is if as an artist, comic book artist, you're going to be doing a series of comic book pages, and they all need to be on a standardized template. Such as, for me, it was the DC Comic Books template. When I got my first assignment at DC, which was drawing Seven Soldiers, Mr. Miracle, DC sent me a packet of art paper to get started with, and I just scanned in one of those pages, and I recreated all those guide rules in Photoshop so that I could use that recreation as a master page template and basically just base all of my pages off of that document. So what a master page template does is after you've established it once, you can always just copy or duplicate, rather. You can duplicate that same master page template for every page you draw from then on out. So instead of each time creating a new template or a new Photoshop document to put your digitally drawn comic book page in, once you've established the template one time, then always keep that on file in a reference library, and then you're about to start a new project. You just copy that digital or the master page template. Effectively, what I use it for is I'll copy it, 22 times into a folder, and for page 1 through 22 of a comic book, and then I open up the master page template for page 1, and then I start drawing in it for whatever goes on page 1. So there are some artists who, if they're trying this out, if they're trying to make a digital conversion, I think making the master page template is a way to also get familiar with the tools in Photoshop, and I lay it out very step-by-step on how to create the master page template in Photoshop. For somebody who maybe has a good understanding of Photoshop or is under a tight deadline and would actually rather not have to create a master page template from scratch, I also offer, on my website, I have a new section I just created called DigiArt Quick Tools that I'm offering tools that will make working digitally for comic books. It'll make that process easier. Some of these tools are templates, JavaScript, Photoshop, or paths rather, and even later I'll be offering Ruby scripts, which is something to be used in SketchUp, but I don't have anything yet for that. And I have a template. I have a few master page templates on my website, freddieart.com, in the DigiArt Quick Tools section. Creating a master page template is very valuable, but and that's the reason I devoted an entire chapter to it. But if somebody either has already created one, but they want one that's more of the dimensions specifically for DC Comics or for Marvel Comics or for Dark Horse or Image, I actually have those already pre-made on my site that somebody could download if they were interested. I think at least once, especially for beginner to intermediate users, they should probably build at least one master page template just to have the experience to fully understand it and to get familiarized with the tools.
This is a dumb question almost. Obviously, because you wrote the book, did you decide on the sequential organization of the chapters? Because I really liked the way this flowed, because I've read a lot of how-to books myself and also tech books for computers. One of the things that I've found it's a frustration with some of them that I've read is that the chronological order they go in doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I use the index and jump around the book a lot more than I did when I was reading this, for example. You jumped right from this master page template chapter to Chapter 7, Time-Saving Libraries, which just makes a whole lot of sense to me because we were discussing this, now we're jumping over to there. Was that something that, as you were creating the book, you kind of logically did yourself, or was that something that came about through discussions with an editor or people who read the book along the way, or how did that come about?
Good question, because it's actually a combination of all of those things. My original pitch outline, basically the order of them was originally laid out by myself, showed them also to Jim Mitchell, who's a good friend, and who's a very smart guy as well, and he gave me his feedback. And then along the way, I know that John Morgan, my editor for the book, also had feedback. So I'm glad that it easily transitions from one chapter to another, and I think all of us had a hand in that. So a combination, I guess. Just from my own standpoint, when going into, I don't know, any sort of, because it's not like I've read a lot of how-to books on the digital side of stuff, but whenever reading any programming book, like about, JavaScript, for example, or something, you can tell pretty quickly if the writers got into JavaScript either because they took a class on it and then later on organized their thoughts in the way that the class introduced it to them, or if they are throwing out facts and ideas in a nonlinear fashion, and it becomes difficult to, at least for me, it becomes difficult to follow. You get lost in the process. You don't necessarily see a logical progression from A, B, C to D. Instead, maybe they're jumping around from A to L, and somehow that makes sense to them, but it's not necessarily intuitive. So I guess intuitive is probably the word that I'm looking for, is an intuitive progression from one subject to the next.
But just even general talking workflow of the book. One of the things I liked we're seeing in the time-saving libraries as well as the other chapters, you go into the how you do something, then you're going into, this is what you do, this is the how, but you also go into that why. Like, this is why. This will help you as a time-saving thing. This is a nice little tool. You save it, it's done, you put it in the background. If you need to pull it out later, hey, you got it right there. So it was a really good, just instructional, it was a guide, but it was more than just a do this, and this. It kind of gave you the whatnot behind the processing.
The whatnot. Yeah, it's that's one of the big benefits of working digital, and if you're not utilizing that, such as once you've done, an example of this would be a master page template or creating a path like Superman's S. If you're, doing a series of pages with Superman, instead of drawing his S every single time you draw him, why not take an extra 5 or 10 minutes to path out in Photoshop, create a stencil, so to speak, of his S symbol, and then every time from then on out, every time that it's required that you show the Superman symbol, you can just go to that path as your source and distort it, make it look like it's on his chest, and then it'll save you time in the long run, and it'll also improve the integrity of the artwork because it'll be more consistent S. It won't look malformed or anything. So I wanted to highlight those sort of time-saving devices, especially if people think it might take them or nervous about the ramp-up time or the learning curve on getting into this. They will be spending some extra time learning it, but once they've learned it, they'll end up saving time in the long run.
In the years that I've been teaching, I've started working a lot more digitally in the sense that a lot of the things I used to do on paper, my lesson plan books, things like that, all of that is now on the computer. Websites that I use with the kids, papers that I used to use with the kids, I've scanned them all in. They're all digital on my computer. One of the things I found as I was doing that, though, was clutter builds up very fast. Chapter 7 is great because you go through just ways to lay out different master reference folders, ways to work with programs as far as saving things, and just a certain organization as to how to do that, which even if somebody reading Chapter 7 doesn't use your exact ways of organizing things, it gives them a framework to work off of to say, hey, these are some of the things that I've found that were really helpful to be able to find things really quick when I need them. But one of the great things about being digital in that sense, you've got everything with you in one spot. Because I used to leave manuals at work that I needed at home. But now with everything being digital and I'm having them all in one place, I've got everything with me whenever I need it. You talk about reference right in the kickoff of that chapter, and that's got to be great as an artist to have your reference with you wherever you're at, because you talked about working off your laptop sometime as well as working off of your desktop, and being able to have access to those things, whether you're at your desktop or your laptop or wherever, it's got to be very helpful as well.
Oh, yeah, it is. And also, specifically with reference, I used to have a huge collection of reference in an analog way, meaning that I had lots and lots of 3-ring binders that had magazine clippings, drawings that I had done that my friends had done or whatever, Xeroxes from anatomy books. I just would try to organize it in all these different 3-ring binders, and what I found is that it became so cumbersome that I wouldn't use it. So as extensive, I made it so extensive that I couldn't use it anymore. So with scanning in and organizing your entire reference collection digitally, it is much more accessible, much quicker to look through. Adobe Photoshop CS2, I think it's CS and above, so CS 2, 3, and 4, all have a program that come with it called Bridge, Adobe Bridge. I do not talk about this in the how-to book, but I think it's pretty it's common knowledge once you get into Photoshop that there's a program called Bridge. Usually there's even a button you can click on in Photoshop that'll take you to Bridge, so it's a connected program. And you can customize how you see your reference, and you can see a whole bunch of different JPEGs on the screen at the same time. You can adjust the size of them and stuff. So when you're looking through it, you're not flipping one page to the next, to use an analogy of a 3-ring binder. Instead, you're seeing a whole screen filled with as many JPEGs as you want to make room for, and it's very time-saving. And in addition to that, in that chapter, in Chapter 7, talking about time-saving libraries, I also discuss creating actions and droplets, although I just briefly go into them. They're a way to automate certain procedures, such as if you're going to save out a series of images at 950 pixels tall or something, ready to email them to your editor. Instead of doing that manually each time, you can set up an action to do it. So I discuss how to do that. I briefly talk about it. And also, if you have created customized textures or customized brushes that give different, instead of, here's an example of a real time saver. If somebody has scaly skin, instead of drawing each of those scales individually, you can, what I did in the how-to book, which is I took a digital photo of some gravel, or rather a piece of sidewalk that had started to bust up, and so it was creating what looked similar to a pattern of scales. I go through the step-by-step procedure showing how to go from that photograph to a customized brush that you can then basically paint with a series of scales so that it looks like you're applying a texture without having to draw them individually, and how you can then save and back up those customized brushes so that you won't lose them, or you can share them with yourself on another computer or a friend or something. So the time-saving library that is actually, to me, the most important thing on my computer, on my hard drive. My reference library is pretty massive at this point, and I back it up on a regular basis and have extra backups even off-site, so to speak. I gave a copy to one of my friends just so that, although it might be slightly out of date, it is so important. I've invested so much time in organizing and the initial scanning in and organizing of my reference library that it would be devastating if anything happened to it.
Well, it's also a reference library of your own materials that you've created as well, which I thought was interesting. Because when I see reference, when I first think of reference, I'm thinking of outside reference sources. And as we were going through the chapter and I was reading it, I'm like, well, gosh, this makes so much sense. The way you draw symbols, the way that you do certain backgrounds, and what you do with those backgrounds. It would be important to have those as well for consistency, for, okay, when I'm looking back at this, I want to kind of tweak this because I've always wanted to tweak that and be able to look back at what I've done previously. I thought that was interesting to see that it wasn't just the outside reference work, but how much of it is also your own work, and why it would be important to have all of that referenced as well.
Yeah, to be easily called upon is the point of all of that stuff, is ease of use, and you only have so many hours of the day. You need to minimize and save time wherever you can, and that's a really good step to take. It's the equivalent of all those 3-ring binders that I had of my reference collection. If it's too much, too hard to use, it's going to be unusable. So you've put all that time into creating something that's no longer functioning.
We get into Chapter 8, it's digital roughs. Now, what are roughs?
Okay, rough stands for rough layout. And rough layout is all about, once you read the script that you get from a writer, the comic book script, the initial ideas that you have on how the page will look, just the rough shapes without of each figure. So if Superman's punching a guy, you still draw the gesture of him punching and the guy reacting to it, but you don't have to make the proportions perfect or the anatomy perfect. So roughs is basically just laying out the page. It's creating just a simple idea of what will become more elaborate later, so that you don't have to worry about all the later stuff. You're just worried about the fundamental storytelling of guiding someone's eye from one part of the page to the other. So, and actually, to me, roughs are the most mentally taxing part of drawing a comic book page. It is not the most time-consuming if you just looked at hours, but it's the most difficult, because you're essentially taking the written word and your imagination and trying to apply that into some sort of shapes. You're trying to materialize a nebulous idea. And so in the rough stage, that's actually where I think a lot of the digital that's where a lot of benefits come into play from working digitally, because you can flip compositions. Imagine if you drew the perfect punching pose, but it's facing the wrong way, or it's needs to be rotated or scaled a little bit. Then you can do that stuff in Photoshop, and it's very easy. But I go through that procedure. Also, if you have extra ideas while you're drawing. You draw a punching pose, it's not quite right for this, but you might as well save it and put it in your master reference library. I also talk about how to resize and save out images for your editor to look at, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, what was really cool at the end, you put a nice note to the beginners, which I thought was really great, to just kind of give some tips like, hey, here's some things that you need to know if you're just getting started out with this, which I liked that, because as you're going through all this, it really is something that I felt, whatever stage you're at in this process, this book was pretty accessible to get an act. But I liked your little tips, because I think that's what makes a book more personal. And like I said, I've read a lot of how-to books, a lot of guidebooks, and some of them it's like pulling teeth when you get through them. And this one felt personal throughout, because there was a lot of personality to it, where you weren't afraid to throw in like little tips and tricks and things like that, which I think is what we all, whenever we're reading a guidebook, that's what we really want. Those little personal things like, hey, what went wrong, and how did you fix it? And is there a way to fix it? And those were littered throughout this, that it is okay to have problems along the way, and there are fixes for them, and this is what you do, and here's some tips, and just kind of keep in mind that that's part of the playing process. One question I had, when we were taking a look at the roughs, rough caption and dialogue placement, I guess it's something I never thought about. Do you a lot of times find that when you go and do your art, does doing it digitally help when you need to go back and put in those captions and dialogues to find the space for them? Because I can imagine as an artist, when you're drawing a scene that you're given in the script, there's got to be times where you go back and say, okay, where do I put the words now, or where are the words going to go? And is that part of the reason why you then would do the roughs, so that way before you get into the heavy work of really doing a detailed page, you know exactly where those are going to go before you do the drawing?
Absolutely, you're right on the money. I find it very helpful to know where the dialogue and narration captions, the approximate location of them, and it is exactly for that. It's so that you don't waste a lot of time drawing a big crowd of people in an area that's going to be covered up with a big word balloon. My very first efforts drawing comic books back in '97 was the very first full comic book that I ever attempted to draw, and I never took into account how much narration or dialogue there was. So when getting lettering back, it was abysmal for everyone in the process. I was not happy because so much of the work was covered up. The lettering artist had to think of very creative and subpar solutions to where to put the captions, because I had so much effectively important information that needed to be covered up. So it was my own poor planning. That is a very essential part. In fact, I think Mike Mignola wrote about, I'm not even sure which book I was reading, I think it's called Comics Panel or something like that, I can't remember. But in any case, he was saying that the lettering is a part of the design, it's a part of the composition. If you don't account for where the lettering will go, you are missing out on a huge part of the composition. You're ignoring a big facet, and you even know that it's going to be there. So it's irresponsible even. He didn't say all that, but I'm saying it's irresponsible for you not to take into account where the lettering is going to go. Even if you're working as an artist working from an loose script or an open script, which is closer to the Marvel method, which is working from a plot, even then you should still account for if this is going to be a dialogue-heavy area and accounting for that. My editors, especially on Run, basically used my dialogue placement guidelines or guides for where to put the dialogue. They didn't follow it to a T, but it gave them an idea of where I thought it would need to go and where I basically accounted for it. So it's essential.
As we're talking about this, the next logical flow then is, okay, we've got everything laid out. We know what everything, what the book's going to look like when we're done. We got to get into wireframes. I got to say one thing before we talk about Chapter 9, though. That shot of Blue Beetle that you did, I remember that issue, that fill-in issue that you did of Blue Beetle with Superman in it. That is one of my favorite pieces that you've ever done.
Oh, great.
Because I so much, and it's every time I see it, I smile, because I think Blue Beetle in that particular scene represents all of us. We all wanted to fly along with Superman like that, and it is every time I see that particular shot. I know when we had you on, when you had done that issue, I remember saying that to you there, and it was one of those things when I turned that page, I'm like, oh, there it is. One of my favorite sequences, so I just wanted to note that one again, because I think it was Blue Beetle number 15.
It was, yeah. It was a fill-in issue of it. And thank you very much. I honestly made a pass through all the artwork that I had done, looking for images that were, of course, good examples of whatever throughout this process, anything that I laid out in the book. But secretly, my other objective was to use as many shots of Superman as I could. So I didn't have a whole ton of Superman shots that really were applicable, unfortunately. So I ended up, I just used whatever really would work. But any opportunity that I had, I tried to get some Superman in there, because and that's why I chose him for the cover as well. Just I wanted to draw Superman. So.
The screenshots throughout the book as well of various stages of art development, of what your computer screens look like, things like that. Myself, I'm a very visual person. I like to see what my end product should look like, even if mine looks a little different because I'm personally doing it. It's nice to be able to, throughout the book, be able to see, while we've got these wonderful text pieces that are doing step by step, you also have a visual that you can count on and look at and say, okay, my screen should look something like this if I'm doing things properly. And then I can know right away if I'm not, okay, this is my target goal as far as what it should roughly look like. I really appreciated that throughout the book because it's a very visual book.
Yeah, and I am, like you, a very visual person as well. And there was far more screen captures than what made it in the book. We had to cut back quite a bit because I had so much of them. The book would have had to been an extra, 30 pages or something probably for us to really fit everything in there and still have a good design sense and stuff. So I wanted people to have that exact reaction that you just said, is be able to follow along and not feel like they're getting lost in a jungle of words or something.
Now, for people who are new to this, you've talked about wireframes on the show before, but what are wireframes for people who haven't heard that before?
Wireframes is a term that I use. They are tight structure drawings that are drawn, so if you're drawing a figure, for example, you are drawing all of the anatomy on the whole figure and all the design elements. So if it's Superman, you have the cape and the S and everything in his boots. But the wireframe drawings, are devoid of any sort of light or texture, or I should say shadow or texture. And the point of a wireframe is just to make sure that it's to keep you honest, to be honest. To be honest, it's to keep you honest. It's so that as an artist, at least for me when I was younger, I would have a tendency to get so excited about wanting to jump to the rendering stage of a piece of art that I would sometimes build that artwork on faulty structure or faulty anatomy. And when you're drawing something, imagine, there's no place to hide basically when you're drawing something, drawing a wireframe drawing, because there is no shadow to hide stuff behind. There's no texture to try to cover up, a misshaped back or chest or whatever. In other words, it's to make it as clear as possible exactly what the anatomy looks like, and if it's not right, make it right, and to get all your perspective down before you go to the next step, whether it be the hybrid inks or the digital ink. So wireframes to me is artistically speaking, I guess, roughs are the most important layout-wise, but wireframes to me is the most important mechanical step to make sure that everything is structurally sound.
You have some great shots in the book of your wireframes or your figure drawings of Tim Drake. And one of the things I know as a fan myself that I appreciate about art is, even though we're seeing a flat page, my favorite artists, when I look at the character, I feel like they're the side that we're not seeing of them, like behind them or the side view of them, like we could somehow pan the camera around and we'd see all those things, even though they're not there. There's something about the artwork that it makes my mind see all those things. So when I'm looking even at your figure drawings of Tim there, and I see that they're there in your figure drawings as you're doing it, you're constructing that as a part of the construction of that character, and then we're seeing it then in the finished work also on those pages as you get there, we see him swinging with Batman. It's one of the things that I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what it's important to me as a fan, as a reader, as somebody who appreciates art, to see those elements in the process, because that is the difference to me between art that I find the most visually pleasing and artwork that I tend to pass over a little bit faster than that. I tend to come back and look at those pages more because for some reason there's that visual trick that you look at it and you feel like, okay, I'm seeing him from a different angle at this point. And I think that's because those elements are there.
Oh, great. Good. That's a really big compliment. I mean, we are working on a two-dimensional surface, so to speak. Tricking the eye using a sense of depth is more of a tool in the arsenal when you're doing inks or pencils, honestly. In the wireframe stage and what I cover here in the wireframes chapter, in Chapter 9, it's more talking about, there's not a lot of discussion about line weights in this. Line weights can oftentimes bring contrast and create emphasis on what is in the foreground versus the middle or background. But it does talk about, in Chapter 9, how to create something called cardboard cutouts, which are basically, that is the backbone of how I draw most of my comic book images. It's where you're creating in a new layer group in Photoshop, which is like a folder inside your layers palette, creating a self-contained object of that figure. So if it's an entire figure, you would basically have this figure in an element, a layer group, by itself, and then you could move it around anywhere on the image, on the page. And if your background has been completely drawn in behind that figure on a layer underneath it, and then the cardboard cutout is above it, then you can place him anywhere, and he has a knockout layer that'll make him look opaque, so it blocks out anything behind him. It's similar to an animation cell.
I was just thinking, like, I've seen a lot of, we went to Disney World a couple of times, and they have an art studio there where you can actually see the classic Disney films, and you can see the characters are on the top layer, and the backgrounds, and other elements, actually. So there's a lot of times there's more than one layer there of elements that are on there. I was thinking of animation with that.
Very good, and actually that's an analogy I draw in the book is, or at least mention that it is similar to an animation cell. Instead of drawing on celluloid, which is what they used for the traditional cell animation, instead of drawing on tracing paper or vellum or something, you're just drawing on a layer that has a transparent background. So that's another way to understand layers in a less intimidating way. It's like you're just drawing on an infinitely transparent piece of tracing paper, and you have as many pieces of paper as you want. So if you want to draw Robin on the top one and then draw whoever he's fighting on the next one underneath it, and then underneath that draw the background or whatever, so that each of those elements can be tweaked and rotated and stuff without then affecting the rest of the drawing, in the sense that, if I were to draw a background that basically on that layer, the background only came up to where Robin started, so it stops where Robin starts. And then all of a sudden I was like, you know what, I need to flip Robin. I need to flip him around so that he's facing the opposite direction, or I need to rotate him or scale him. Then that background is going to have blank spots where I did not create the rest of the drawing. So instead of doing that, I suggest, unless you're in, I guess, a really tight deadline, so I'm guilty of this, but is to just draw the entire background like you were drawing it for cell animation, because they oftentimes have an entire background plate, and then have your figure as a cardboard cutout that is then on top of it. The benefit of that, even though it might seem like a waste of time at first, is the entire background that you've created, you can then, if it's an extensive one, you can save that background out and potentially use it as a stat background later on. For anyone who's not familiar with that term, a stat background is just you're duplicating or reusing that background somewhere else. It can be a time-saving trick. I have used that quite a bit. I usually suggest, though, just for safety and for just so you don't turn off some of your more observant readers, that you usually change something about that background if you ever reuse it. You either re-ink it, because although I'm skipping ahead here, but later on when I talk about inks, you are inking on a separate layer by itself, so you can always just trash that layer, and then basically you're left with a clean wireframe of the background again, so you could flip it, distort it, and then re-ink it, and it'll feel less like a duplicate of the same already used artwork.
Well, Chapter 11's inks, and you separated that on purpose because of the fact that we go into Chapter 10 into pencils for the pencil workflow hybrid, because there might be reasons to set, like you said, to set it up for a traditional inker, or because an editor wants them penciled, or because you want the physical originals afterwards. I did like that about the book, that it was flexible to be used for a variety of different purposes. So Chapter 10 goes into a different option if you're going to go the pencil route.
I have a feeling that using the pencil hybrid workflow will probably be where a lot of artists, a lot of pencilers, will start their experimentation going digital or starting down that route. And it's because this is the biggest, as a penciler, now I do pencils and ink for my own work, but for a while I was just doing pencils. And the old way of working was to do on a piece of printer paper, 8.5 by 11, I would do my roughs, and then take it to a place like, Kinko's or a copy shop, get it blown up to 11 by 17 size, and then lightbox onto a piece of artboard. There's nothing wrong with that process other than that it's just very time-consuming, at least it is for me. The alternative to that I proposed in Chapter 10, the pencil hybrid workflow, is to instead work out your roughs digitally so that you can get them exactly how you want them as far as the nuances of the storytelling. Even go a little bit past the rough stage. Go to something I call breakdowns, which, that's not a completely new term. That's pretty normal, but it's a step beyond roughs. It's when you start getting into the anatomy and stuff. It's almost like the pencil's equivalent of a wireframe. You're getting more into the anatomy of it, but it's just not as clean usually. So then when you have your breakdowns done, what the step I'm about to say takes the place of the lightboxing step. You're already drawing on the computer at 11 by 17, and then either get a large format printer yourself or just take it to Kinko's or something, and have your breakdowns printed in light blue onto the artboard so that it has just saved you the step of lightboxing. So if someone picks up this book for no other reason than to just cut out the lightboxing stage, which to me was the most tedious, I hated that step. If I was doing a series of pages, I would just dread the lightboxing stage. What I just described in the pencil hybrid workflow, and it goes more in depth in the chapter itself, that alone would save you a lot of time. And that will also give you the experience of working in Photoshop, which could then potentially grow into the all-digital workflow or the ink hybrid workflow that I also discussed.
This is a great chapter, again, for the amount of screenshots and shots of the artwork and what it's going to look like at various stages, because you show a lot of different scenarios. The cleaning up the penciled art section for direct-to-color. That was great because you get to see the original artwork of the Flash, but then the different stages of what you can do with it on the computer zoomed in at various levels, and also next to it what the tools and the screen's going to look like for you when it's in front of you. That's really helpful when you're trying to work with something to say, okay, am I doing this right? What should my toolbar look like and all that stuff? Because you're covering a lot. And if you don't have that hand being, it really is one of the things I liked about this. It felt like you were there with me when I was reading this and what your screen looked like for it. So that was something that I really appreciated when you talked earlier about the amount of screenshots that were in here. I think they're essential in this case to feel like that.
Working in the hybrid workflow for pencils, the end result will generally be a much cleaner looking page at the end of the process that will have less smudges and that sort of thing. So there's the real possibility of going straight to color from pencils just by darkening the pencils and cleaning it up. So even though they're generally cleaner than a normal page of pencils, I do discuss like what you just said, Sean, about cleaning them up further, eliminating the blue and then additional cleanup past that point as well.
Chapter 11, whichever options you've gone through in Chapter 9 and 10, inking digitally over wireframes or inking over the pencils. What is the difference in that process? Because is it different to ink over wireframes than it would be over regular pencils, or how does that work out?
It is different. Inking over wireframes is more akin to doing finishes. If anyone's familiar with that term, it's basically when you get the opportunity as an inker to add all the texture and shadow yourself. So it's more like inking over breakdowns, I guess, but just really, really clean breakdowns where some of your work is already done, because when we're drawing in the wireframe stage, we're drawing in black. And then whenever we go to the ink stage, the most basic structure of it, since it's already in black, means that some of your inks are already done for you. I remember before I went digital or was just beginning that process, I remember the process that I had when inking my own stuff is I would lay out, after I lightboxed it in light blue, the next step is I would go over with regular pencil and flesh out the figures with all of its anatomy. And then over the top of that, I would take a repeatograph and ink effectively the wireframe over the entire image, and then I would let that dry and then erase the entire page, leaving only the wireframe. And then on top of it, I would ink the rest of the way. It was kind of a slow process or whatever, and that's basically what has translated into how I'm working here. I found that working from a very clean but accurate structure drawing in ink and then applying your inks on top of that was what appealed to me the most. So that is what inking over wireframes is. Inking over pencils, usually if you're doing digital inking, you're most likely inking over somebody else's pencils. So I discuss if you were to get a high-res scan, or if you scanned it yourself, page of penciled art, and then inking over the top of it, so that you're not just creating the line out of nowhere like you would with the wireframe, inking over wireframes. You are instead enhancing, clarifying, creating depth, just like a normal traditional inking would. But in working digital, you could try different textures. You're inking in a layer group above the pencils or above the wireframes, and I would sometimes try different rendering types. So, like, let's say if there was a piece of penciled art that had 5 or 6 feather lines in someone's neck or something, I might try that digitally, make a new layer, try to do a loose feathering. I don't know if that works or not. Turn off that layer, make a new layer, and instead create one really crisp quill line, or a line that you might get from a quill, that has a really fat end and that tapers off into a thin end. And then you could even duplicate that exact same line all the way up his neck, so that you have really crisp and exactly precise lines, or something in between. I mean, it just gives you a lot of different options in working digitally. As an inker, or if you are somebody who wants to ink digitally, you can create customized brushes that have different pressure sensitivity, smooth or rough finishes around the edges of the brush, and I discuss how to do that as well in Chapter 7.
When you were talking about inking pencils, you did digital inking over finished pencils, but also pencils with more rendering, showing that there's 2 different options as far as how you might have to work with it. Then you took it one step further as far as wrapping things up and preparing it for an editor, which I think anyone reading a guidebook wants to know, okay, I'm new to this process, haven't done it this way before. I know what I need to turn in. How do I get to that stage? Is it possible for me in this book to get a successful end product? And it is all right there, because I think sometimes guidebooks forget to put in that last step. It's actually the single most important step is, at the end, what do I do with it then to get things professionally where I need them to be?
And that's the reason that I included it. And aside from that, I remember speaking to some of my editors about the perceived, kind of antiquated now, but the perceived prejudice against digital art whenever it first came around. I think it was Peter Tomasi who I was talking to, that he said when it first came about, his only concern was, well, is it going to produce the artwork that I want, that I'm asking for? And if so, I don't really care. I don't really care how you get there. And so if you're using digital means, but it's, it looks good and it's on time, I'm cool with that. So I just wanted to, throughout the book, talk about just realistic solutions that are coming from the vantage point of a professional comic book artist who understands what's needed. And that's one of the big ones. It was just then at the end of the chapter talking about completing the process, which is delivering a high-resolution TIFF that's usually in bitmap mode to the publisher or to a colorist, is also discussed in there. The traditional way to get this sort of artwork is to get a bitmap TIFF is most artists will have been instructed to, on their scanner, scan in a piece of artwork in what's called line art mode, I think it is. And it does an okay job, in my opinion, of it just scans in the artwork in either black or white. There's no shades of gray, and saves it as a TIFF file, or as a bitmap TIFF. The disadvantage of that is when scanning something in line art mode, you don't have, as an artist or as the person who's scanning it, you don't have the versatility of adjusting what comes in as black or what comes in as white. What I mean is, as artists, anyone who's inked traditionally knows that sometimes the opacity of the ink that you're using is not as dark as some of the other pieces or parts of the inked drawing. So if an area is a little bit weak, so some of your render lines maybe where after you erased over it, it kind of removes some of the ink, and so the inks look a little bit grayish. Those areas that you've worked on, you labored over, might actually disappear if you scan it just in line art mode. So I suggest instead that whether you're doing a fully digital inks or if you're scanning in the hybrid inks or whatever, that you scan it in RGB mode, actually, high-resolution RGB. I then talk about how to eliminate whatever dirt that you have, and then go into how you manually change it to a bitmap, and how you can do that in a controlled fashion so that you're paying attention to the line integrity, not the scanner. The scanner doesn't know any better, but you can go through and manually change settings. You could even potentially lasso certain areas. If that area I just described that's a little bit weaker with the inks, you could select that and treat it differently than the rest of the image. The rest of the image is very, opaque with its ink. Then you can have that with a different setting and then have the area that's a little weaker, adjust the settings inside of that.
I got to be honest with you, in a lot of books, there's that last concluding chapter, which is kind of like the closing chapter. In a lot of the guidebooks I've read, I tend to skip that one. I've got to tell you, I really liked this closing chapter, chapter 12, Looking Forward, because one of the things you did with this is show how you're very realistic about the nature of computers, technology, and software. The fact that Photoshop is going to keep making new versions, it makes sense that they would keep the palettes that are there as they add new features. But you also talk about how the sensibilities that are in this book can be adapted to the changing technologies as they come about. I really liked that because that's always going to be the case with any book. It's computers are like a car. The second you drive it off of the lot, it's out of date. And computers and software are the same way. But you're right in the sense that the sensibilities that are being presented here can be modified and applied as those technologies change. And also encouraging people to continue the revolution, to continue growing.
That's partially because even through the course of writing the book, things changed for me and my work process. I discussed briefly using 3D models in the very last chapter. Working in 3D can revolutionize, I think, how backgrounds and props and cars and stuff like that can be drawn in comic books. And so I briefly touch on that because even at the time that I was concluding the book, it was still early on in the procedure for me. Basically, I wanted to discuss creating comic books just in Photoshop and contained within that, and I didn't want to discuss a working procedure that I wasn't comfortable with myself yet, and I didn't want to teach it from a point of only half knowledge anyway. So I briefly discussed that, and it is the spirit of it. The word spirit is maybe not one that's real common when talking about anything with computers, but it's the spirit of the user, of always being prepared to look beyond what you're currently comfortable with and currently using to what might be better, more interesting, a little faster, give you a different outcome. It keeps things fresh for you as an artist. It can keep the artwork from becoming stale. If you feel like as an artist you're not learning anything, and that goes for the artwork, for the digital process or anything, then your work will become very stale very quickly. So always keep yourself guessing and look for new stuff that's down the road. Don't be afraid to just experiment.
The DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics is available this week on Tuesday, September 1st. It's available at Amazon.com and various internet sites for pre-order. List price is $22.95. You can get it for $15.61 at Amazon.com, but it is available all over the internet or at any of your local bookshops. So please make sure to check them out. And if they don't have it at their bookshop, ask them to order it.
At Amazon right now, they have, I know at least for the pre-order, I don't know if it'll change on the 1st or something, but they have the discount they have is a pretty good one. I think that it's available if you pre-order the DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics. You can buy it for like $15 or $16, and then if you complete your order something higher than $25, then you get the Super Saver shipping. So
yeah, it's for free on orders over $25.
Now, most people will only need one book. So if they have other deals on there as well that you can get. What I mean is most people will only need one copy of the DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics. But my aunt bought pre-ordered 5 copies, so she definitely qualified for the super.
Nice.
But other people, you could always just add one more thing on there, or pick up one of the previous DC Comics Guide books because they're very effective. I found the DC Comics Guide to Writing was very informative. It's by Denny O'Neil, who is very famous in comics, and also the lettering and coloring guide would be a good companion to my book, just because if you read my book, you'd know how to create the real crisp line art and then go into the coloring part from the previous book might be a good companion for it.
Or even a trade of your Robin or the Flash would go along with this, which is great for people which I can say that, you don't have to, which would be great to put along with it because, in all honesty, your artwork is throughout this. It'd be great to see what the finished product looks like alongside with the screenshots at the various stages. So that'd be great for anyone. If they haven't read Robin or the Flash, shame on you. You should definitely pick that up and have it shipped along with it. And you get the free shipping.
And as a side bit of interest here, there is a piece of artwork in the how-to book, in the DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics, that I altered. Now, there's several pieces that I altered just for examples in the book. So the majority of them won't qualify. But there is one piece of art that I added a character who was not in the original piece of artwork that was published by DC. So the first person to visit my website, freddieart.com, and email me, there's an email link from there, who gets that correct, then I'll send you a free sketch, like a bust shot or something in pencil. So, and I think that there's only one page. So as soon as that happens, though, I'll then post a bulletin on my site that lets somebody know that, who beat them out or whatever. So just keep an eye out for that. And it's a 150-page book around about there. So it's just somewhere in the book. You'll have to be a little meticulous.
The book's fun to look at because of all the artwork at various stages, and I'm a big fan of that aspect of it, is the fact that you get to see artwork at various stages throughout the creative process. It's kind of like, for fans of comic book artwork, it's kind of like a director's cut to be able to see that through in those stages, and that's always fun for me to kind of, because we don't always get a chance to look at artwork this way. And then to see in a lot of these pages, then the finished artwork that came from that is a lot of fun. I'm going to be looking for it as well. not for the pencil sketch, because I've got a little bit of an advantage to looking at it, looking for it a little bit early. But I'm going to be digging through my comics as well to kind of see what that piece is as well. That's very cool, though. That's a neat little Easter egg in the book for anyone who picks it up, that they can be a part of that contest. Freddie, as always, it's a true pleasure to have you on Raging Bullets. Thank you for your time, and I'm really excited to read your book again this week, actually, to see, because this will be my chance to actually read the final paper copy of it.
I very much appreciate you guys having me on the show, and it's always good to talk to you guys. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Freddie.
Green Lantern, let you and I destroy that space junk.
I want to once again thank longtime friend of the show, Freddie E. Williams II, artist and author of the DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics. That is available on September the 1st. So if you're hearing this before that, please make sure to head on over to Amazon.com or your favorite bookseller to pick that book up. Also sponsoring us this episode, DCBService.com, where this week you can check out the pre-orders, discounts up to 75% off on new materials. Thank you, DCBService.com, for continuing to support us comic fans with those discounts. I want to remind everyone our in-stock trades book of the month for September. Preacher, the Book 1 hardcover, covering issues 1 through 12, regularly $39.99, 47% off, only $21.19. Or you can go the trade paperback route, get volume 1 and 2. Each one is $14.99 regularly, 47% off, only $7.94 each. Orders of $50 or more, and you can add some of Freddie's work on it. That's a great way to get some of Freddie's trade paperbacks as well. Orders of $50 or more get you free shipping from InStockTrades.com. So it's a great way also to increase that order. If you're a fan of Freddie E. Williams II's work, pick up some of his trade paperbacks. And thank you, InStockTrades.com and DCBService.com, for continuing to support our show. We'll be back this week, continuing our discussion on For Tomorrow. So you're going to get another episode this week. It'll be towards the end of the week, either Thursday or Friday. Check RagingBullets.com for official details on the release date of that. But we'll be back again. I know we're coming back sooner with some of these episodes. We've had some great recording opportunities, and we want to pass on that content to you guys quickly. So thanks again, and we will see you in a few days.
Bye.